It is my very great pleasure to introduce our keynote luncheon speaker today, Dr. Mike Condra. You will see his impressive letters after his name on the slide. I won't try to display my ignorance on saying what the full forms of them are. His topic, Fostering a Healthy Workplace, fits perfectly within the theme of this conference. Dr. Condra is a consultant psychologist, and he provides training and consultation in the areas of mental health education, stigma reduction, crisis intervention, and de-escalation skills. He has provided consultation and advice to many organizations on issues involving mental health, employees who are at risk, and understanding and dealing with disruptive behavior and lethality risk. He has extensive experience in providing public education, training workshops, and consultation on these topics across Canada and internationally. He is the co-author with Meryl Zeisman-Gary of a book called Mental Health Disabilities at Work, a practical guide for employees, employers, and unions. How good does that sound? And it's actually available through Lancaster House, and the materials will be in the conference materials if you're interested in having a look at that. I have read large portions of it, and it's great. He also has a short educational video called What is Mental Health, which is available online, that's had more than 500,000 views and has been adopted in educational programs in North America, Australia, and the UK. He was formerly an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Queen's University. I know we have quite a few Queen's alumni here today. And he actually was the director of the Health, Counseling, and Disability Services at Queen's University for many years. So he's not just the academic, he's a practitioner as well. Mike, over to you.
Well, good afternoon. Lisa, thank you for that very kind introduction. After many years of being introduced like this on the podium, I think, who is that guy? He sounds really good. Yeah. Oh, it's me. Oh, right. I like to start sessions like this by just saying what a genuine personal pleasure it is for me to be talking about health, mental health, and wellness. As you can see, I grew up in 2 or 3 generations ago, at a time when mental health was not talked about, in a culture in which mental health was synonymous with being locked up in a long-term institution, and people suffered significant personal, social, and even employment challenges because of a mental health problem, if it became known. In 1986 or 7, I was a member of the executive of the local soccer association. I'll just use this as a small example. And of course, being involved with the hospital at that time and with the university, they gave me the exciting job of rewriting the Constitution. Now, you folks have more experience in writing than I do. But it was an interesting job. Right there, plunked in the middle, was nobody shall be a member of the executive who has a mental illness. Aside from anything to do with what the law tells us, that felt incredibly wrong. And thankfully, I mean, the reason I was asked to rewrite it was to change stuff like that. And there was no resistance. People understood. That's a good thing. And that's huge progress. Many of you who are younger will think, well, what's he talking about? It's not that much. It is huge. And in this country, we have people like Michael Kirby, Clara Hughes, Mark Holland, Romeo Dallaire, who've openly spoken about their mental illnesses, and that has helped immensely. Let me start you with a story. Our son, Michael, was 13 years old and he wanted a dog badly. Now, Michael is persistent. I can assure you now, this was a long time ago. And he approached his parents, who of course put up the usual token parents' defense, which is who'll walk the dog, who'll buy the food, who'll clean up the poop, But eventually, and in Michael, it didn't take long. I'll tell you a second story if there's time at the end. Eventually, he found a way through it, because he approached his mum and said this: "Mum, I just want you to know, if in 10 years' time I'm on some bloody therapist's couch and she's pointing out that I've had difficulty in bonding, it'll be because I didn't get a dog." 2 days later, we had a dog. It was easy to play the mental health card, right? We don't want our children to have any mental health problems due to the fact that their parents didn't buy them a dog. Now, I'd like to focus today on what I'm going to call the bigger picture, particularly looking at the issue of where we are with regard to mental health, wellness, and workplace wellness in the COVID era. Don't call it the post-COVID era, because I'm not sure what post-COVID means. You probably are all aware there are hundreds, if not thousands, of websites for you to find information about the impacts of COVID on people's mental health and how to deal with that. So I'm going to focus my attention instead on 3 kind of lessons I think the COVID experience has taught us in the context of mental health and wellness. The first is, I want to look a little bit at the transitions that have happened for us as a result of COVID. I think all of us in the room might be forgiven for having forgotten what exactly it was like prior to COVID. It has dominated the news cycle. It has been top of mind. It has resulted in protests. It has resulted in things that we never thought we'd see, which is our healthcare personnel being harassed on their way into work. So it's been everywhere. It has been the biggest disruption that any of us have experienced in our lives, and likely, hopefully, will be the biggest disruption. The other 2 diseases that created a concern, SARS in 2003 and H1N1, which was declared a pandemic in 2009, pale completely by comparison. I mention that because one thing to know about disruption to our lives in this fundamental way is disruption always creates stresses and tensions for us, always. It doesn't matter. You can do that at a micro level. If you have a child, we were getting our grandchild ready to go to school this morning, and if he had a hacking cough, that would have disrupted today for both of us. That happens at a micro level, but this happened at a societal and then a planetary level. Disruptions of that magnitude always bring with them increases in mental health problems, anxiety, depression, addictive disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders. And that's documented historically through all the major disruptions that our societies experienced. If we consider the effects of this pandemic, if you look at how disruptive they were, social isolation, lockdowns, our ability to socialize and comfort each other at times when we really needed it. I just returned last week from Ireland. Eleanor's brother passed away about 5 weeks ago, and I watched how the Irish do funerals. I grew up in Ireland, as you probably can guess, but it was great. And when the lockdown and the isolation was in place, apparently it became something totally different. And I have had a number of people who commented that, what people would do is they would go to the church, they couldn't go in, they would stand outside separated by 6 feet. No hugging, no talking, no getting close to each other. Increasing pressures because of economic destruction. People's livelihoods, in some cases, and businesses being knocked under. Yes, there was support, but we know that the support is not going to completely eradicate the impact. There was quarantine, people rushing back from various places and having to stay in hotels for 10 days, be separated from other people. And then, of course, we had the situation of the long-term care homes, which was heartbreaking and very difficult for all of us to observe. And what about the people who were experiencing it firsthand or secondhand? Next, there was the duration, how long it went on. I'm not sure about you, but when we were back at the beginning and thinking, okay, it's March. Hopefully by June we'll be through this and we'll be back to normal, whatever normal is. And that didn't happen. It just went on and on and on. And that led to the development of habits which have now become a bit of a problem. I think in part, I think about your area of work, which is employment, it's become a bit of a problem, but I'll get to that in a moment. Next, it came in waves. Last November, in my naive way, thinking, okay, we've had 18 months, we're really now on the cusp of getting out of it. And about, I think it was the 20th of November, we heard that word, Omicron. And we had family coming at Christmas, we had a whole pile of things, everything became nervous and anxious, and you probably remember, if you watch the news in the UK, the Prime Minister to come out and say, we have another lockdown, this is big, this is huge. It came in waves. We seemed to be on the verge of overcoming it and then back into it. That kind of unpredictability in our lives is very difficult to deal with. And again, I think about this at a micro level. If one of my children was ill and we didn't know what it was and their symptoms dissipated and they're getting better and then they get worse again and then they get better, it was at a societal level like that. That kind of change is very trying on us because we like a lot of predictability actually in our lives and stability. This introduced a lot of instability. I remember a client telling me very sadly how his spouse, who was employed in a pretty senior position in the bank, when the third lockdown came, he came back into the house from being outside and found her in tears. He said, she is a totally competent person, but we have spent 5 months trying to get the children learning online while she does her job in another room. And that's very strenuous. Then we had the return to work. What a wonderful thing that was going to be. Until we discovered things like, we have to interact now with people that we're not sure if they're vaccinated or not. How many people actually fit in an elevator, right? That sounds like an old joke. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Now, you know the answer to that one, right? Only one, but the light bulb has to really want to change, right? So if we look for a moment at what I call the mental health markers, what things change with regard to mental health? I'll come to habits in a moment. In the first year of the pandemic, which began in March 2020, documentation of things like suicidal ideation showed no change from the previous year. That I wouldn't find that very surprising. There were indications from Chinese studies of increased calls to domestic abuse hotlines. And then in the second year, suicidal ideation in this country changed significantly, it increased. And again, I'm going to come back and talk in more detail about that because it's worth knowing. As well, there was evidence that an increase in reports, what I call self-reports of anxiety and depression and feelings of futility. The other thing to remark on with regard to transition is it had different impacts on different people. Now, by the way, not only did different people experience different symptoms with COVID and then said to their friends, well, it's just like a cold, right? I had it was just like a cold. I biked 20 kilometers a day every day I had COVID. I didn't feel it that badly, but I have friends who were in bed for 3 weeks. We have to remember, this is a general message, please remember that I can't tell you what your experience is like in life, and the same applies to COVID. I don't really know. I want to talk about this transition in relation to habits, right? Habits. you probably know the rule, it takes between 21 and 66 days to develop a persistent habit. Which is why if you check with people on Valentine's Day, most of the New Year's resolutions are broken by that stage. You really have to work at it, 21 to 66 days. And so what happened? Well, people, for example, many people have shifted from working in an office to working at home. And that was of different quality experience. Our son and daughter-in-law both work for pretty large institutions in this country. Our son, he said the company was well prepared. They use a hot desk. I'm not sure how familiar that concept is. Basically, you walk into an open office and you pick whatever desk is free for that day, and the next day somebody's at that desk, you pick a different desk. So moving to work from home wasn't a big deal. Our daughter-in-law, who works for a much bigger and well-known institution in Canada, said it was terrible. They just weren't prepared. But over time, habits develop. And what seemed like an imposition at first becomes a habit. And then it gets well established. And if it's 2.5 years, which it has been, then it's a really well established habit, and people start to see advantages to the new way of behaving. And going back to the old way, which we wanted so much in the beginning, for some people is not such a great deal. Like, I actually like it better doing this. And so we have to think about that kind of transition. And finally, when we return to work, there's some loss of skill. Our social skills may be a little bit rusty. Office etiquette. I don't know about you, but I heard I did a lot of work online and Zoom and so on. Like, the great thing is you only have to look well dressed from about here up, right? I'm here. And I know there's even an advertisement on the TV where the guy admits, see, I'm wearing my pajamas from the waist down or whatever. And that's true. So office etiquette, social skills, social behavior. And then we're going back to people who may have strong feelings, both, I hope everyone has at least 17 vaccinations, to, I wouldn't have any of that poisonous stuff inside my body if you paid me. It's a big scheme, and we all know Bill Gates is behind it, and et cetera, right? So the behavior of others may be, in that transition, quite difficult. So that's the first pillar, the transitions, and how strenuous those were, and how not surprising it would be that they create some difficulty in people's mental health and well-being. The second is what has transitioned, what has changed in our mental health awareness. Now, I actually can't believe this, but I'm actually going to say some negative things about that now that I've said positive things. Some parts of that change in our understanding of mental health is really good. I'll give you some examples. Less kind of underlying feeling that addictions and some mental health problems, particularly things like PTSD, are really lifestyle choices. That's what people choose to do. Spend enough time with someone with PTSD, depression, or an addiction, it may help you to understand it's a really, really hard place to be. Second positive thing is a better understanding of the relationship between stresses, including workplace stresses, and mental illness. Now, we've known that for years about PTSD. PTSD is only triggered by a traumatic event. But now, over the last few years in particular, we're getting more detail about what we can see with regard to that level of disruption. I can assure you post-traumatic stress disorder is, I would regard it as the second most disruptive mental illness that there is. It is very difficult. So we know that, for example, what we call the base rate, which is if you pick a sample of 100 people in the population, how many of them will have PTSD symptoms? And the answer is between 3 and 4, roughly per. In the police force, 9%. So in the general population, 3%, in the police force, 9%, correctional officers, 20%. US correctional officers, 35%. So a clear relationship between cumulative stresses and mental health problems. And this, I use PTSD because it is the one where the data are the clearest, and because we say it's always triggered by some kind of trauma. But the same is true in depression and anxiety. Sometimes that information, here's where I turn a little negative, sometimes the information is just not that terribly helpful. For example, lots of studies out there show an increase in anxiety in people during COVID. But that's typically documented with what we call a self-report scale, like a checklist, which is fine, that's perfectly appropriate, but there's no baseline. We don't know what we're comparing it to. The same is true of suicidal ideation. There is no doubt in the second year of COVID, suicidal ideation went up. But I want to make a distinction between suicidal ideation, which is thinking about killing oneself, and suicidal behavior. In the general population, we expect suicidal ideation is around 2 or 3% at any one time. It went up to about 4%. For at least 10 years, we have known that the occurrence of suicidal ideation in post-secondary schools, both in the US and Canada, runs per year at about 10%. So let me turn to some dry statistics for a minute. Hang on if you don't want to hear numbers. Honestly, this will last about 18 seconds. Epidemiologists measure stuff per 100,000. So if we think about the occurrence of suicidal ideation in people around the age of 18 to 25, out of 100,000, 10,000 will have thought about it in the previous year. The suicide rate in that group is 1 per 10,000. And that's not substantially different from the way it was. In fact, it went down in the first year of COVID. I'm always reluctant to cite suicide numbers, not only because they're sad and depressing, but because the numbers are relatively small. And although people talk, I've read in a very prestigious newspaper, a very prestigious writer talked about an epidemic of suicide. There isn't. The numbers have gone down and up. So they run at about 8 to 12 per 100,000. That's not changed. Now, why is that important? So that we don't get into depressing stuff. Why is it? It's really important because suicidal ideation comes out of a place of feeling helpless or overwhelmed or feeling like we have no option. And if you think about that, especially for young people, it's because sometimes people's horizon is very short. I've seen people who've have thought about killing themselves because their grades in university were not that good. And luckily, we get to a point in life when we realize grades in university are important, but they're not worth your life by a long shot. So there is a lot we can do for people who feel that sense of despondency. That's, for me, is the excellent news, because relatively few, only 1 in 10,000, goes on to actually complete suicide. We can help them. And I suspect, in minor ways, every one of you in this room, and me, we've helped people in lots of ways. Do exactly that. Perhaps they hadn't reached the point of feeling like they want to kill themselves, but they certainly feel desperate and overwhelmed. If you do that for young people or a loved one, you can do it. So part of what I want to talk about with regard to that second piece is our awareness is that sometimes it's given without context. I hear in the media, shocking, alarming changes in this, that, or the other, and then you look and these are small, expectable changes. And they're changes that are reported to us sometimes without telling us there's actually a lot you can do. You can do a huge favor for someone with a mental illness by talking to them, just talking. You can do a huge favor by not judging people. It's amazing. The last thing I want to touch on is what I call these things we know. That was supposed to be a little catchy phrase. These things we know. We already know what it is that makes people well and comfortable and healthy in their work. Some of the topic areas may have changed, like return to work versus working at home. Some of the topics will change about, is this a disability that I'm getting a request for, or is it a preference based on the last 2 years of experience working at home or something else? There is good news. What supports good mental health in the workplace? Being involved in satisfying work. Something that makes your heart sing. I saw a student a number of years ago. I always remember this one particular case. She came in it was about March, 4-year degree program, not doing very well, had already dropped 2 courses in the first 3 years, and was just struggling and taking antidepressant medication. And even one conversation with her, we established that she wanted to be doing something else. I can't remember, fashion design, interior design, something. She wanted to be doing something else, not this degree, which I think was in philosophy. And so we talked about changing the degree from 4 years to 3. She finished the degree, this was March, she finished it in April, she graduated. In October, I got a letter from her saying, "Dear Dr. Condra, I'm now involved in such and such an interior design program. I feel great. Oh, and by the way, haven't taken any medication because I don't need to for the last 3 months." Okay? Now, please understand me. This is not intended to reflect in any way me. I facilitated this, but I didn't do anything. This young person wanted to be doing something. When people do things they enjoy, man, it's good for them. Supportive managers. People who have your back. I had an employee say that to me once. I could not understand this term. "Oh, one thing I really like working with you, Mike, is you have my back." Then I understand. Someone who doesn't badmouth you, or someone doesn't run you down, or someone, as in the case of one of my clients who was back at work after PTSD, being called across the room in front of all of her peers. "Oh, hi there, Mary. That blankety-blank a-hole who works for WSIB has been in touch with me about your case," in front of everybody. Right? Opportunities to advance their skills, opportunities for self-development, involvement and influence at work. Satisfying employment leads to what we call self-efficacy, which is a strong belief in yourself, which is anathema to good mental health. It's really, bad mental health. Feel good about yourself, you're not likely to feel depressed. We know the things that undermine good mental health at work: negative or hostile workplace, harassment in the workplace, an overly stressful pace of work, inattentive management, or in the case of a couple of people I've seen, unresolved safety concerns. We know what helps with stigma in the workplace. Openly talking about and discussing mental health and mental illness. Developing a culture of acceptance in the workplace so that people understand mental health is something we do. Someday, I probably won't live long enough. Someday somebody will come and talk to you about health and not divide it into mental health. Not divide it. Because it's your health. It's your health. The fact that you can't sleep at night worrying because you don't have a job is really not very much different than having the flu. They're the same thing. Or having COVID. It's the same thing. You're distressed, you're non-functional. We fight stigma by modeling respect, by not engaging in stigmatizing language. I remember once a graduate student whom I was supervising, a trainee to become a psychologist. And by the way, I should tell you, she since has become, and I have a huge amount of respect for her, I really like her, she does great work. But she was junior at this point, and we had a supervision session. In supervision, what happens is the candidate comes in, sits down, they talk about the people they've seen, and they ask for your advice if you have any. She said, "Mike, I'm really glad to have this supervision today because that last guy I saw, he was really crazy." I had to explain to her that crazy is a word that's only permitted to be used by PhD psychologists. Someone like you, junior, shouldn't be using that kind of language. That's not right. What was useful about that, and this can be a useful learning for all of us, is not that I want to judge somebody who might use terminology like that, but that we help ourselves to use that as a learning opportunity. She said that in the same way as I would say that if I just don't know what the hell is going on. We say, "That's crazy." Well, it's only crazy as long as we don't understand it. It's not even about empathy, it's just about understanding. And we sat down and explained it, and I can't say I came up with some brilliant insights, but it was more understandable. We can avoid that. We can model a respect. We can foster good learning opportunities about mental health education, awareness, even pamphlets, leaflets, talks, whatever. We can provide effective and compassionate care. Effective and compassionate care. Now, I'm going to end up with what my kids always tell me I'm good at, so I hope to goodness I'm good at this. Here are some tips for you. First, take up modeling. I mean it. Take up modeling. In your work and in your personal life, model the kind of behavior that you would like to see all of us show. Model respect, right? Model humility, model compassion, model empathy. We don't always, empathy for me does not mean that I agree with you, it means I'm trying to understand you. That's what I'm trying to do. Because only in my understanding you can I make a connection. When I'm judging you, I can't connect with you. Model. And make a habit of modeling that for the employees at your work and for other people in your personal life too. Second thing, if you have to deliver bad news, do 4 things. I'm sure you already do them, so I may be, as they say, preaching to the converted. I say, reflect, consult, prepare, and act. I want to tell you a story. I was once called by a vice president of a large company. He had been approached by the human resource person to ask if I'd come and talk to a group of people in the human resource department. They needed someone to help them because in that section of the human resource department, 5 people had been terminated due to a restructuring. So 5 people were terminated, and you folks understand human resource law better than I do. Actually, that's not even a compliment. I don't understand it. So you understand how that happens. It happens quickly. Oh, remember I said reflect, consult, prepare, and then act. Not a great deal of reflection went into this because those 6 people were called to a meeting at 9, while their 12 colleagues were called to another meeting, a business meeting, at the same time. The people were told that they were being terminated, and security came, took them to their office so they'd take up their stuff. I think standard procedure in this institution. And then they were escorted out. As they were being escorted out, the door to the other business meeting opened and all their friends trooped out and saw them being escorted from the building. So the vice president is describing this to me and he says, I don't understand why they need to talk to somebody, but apparently it helps. We do this all the time. Understand why that would have offended or bothered people or created enormous stress. On the one hand, there's the shock of seeing your colleague being let out, what the hell's going on. The other, as you become aware of it, realize they're terrified now they're going to lose their own jobs. So reflect, take your time, put yourself in that person's shoes, then talk to people, then prepare. That doesn't just happen with regard to employment. By the way, I worked with a graduate student who was told that he was terminated from a PhD program on Friday afternoon at 3 o'clock. So unable to get any resources until Monday. So take your time and reflect. The last story is that COVID and its consequences may create problems around what constitutes and grounds for accommodation. Because people settled back into working at home and now being told they have to come to work and people are going to, if you like, some people are going to challenge that on the basis of, well, I don't need to be back at work or I have a disability. And there is a challenge with regard to temporary preference, versus a disability. I also think that there's a challenge for employers with regard to, am I getting the best I can get from this person if they continue to work at home? What is it that they have to be back in the office for? And that's, I realize, is a very individual situation. And I worked in the area of students with disabilities, and we keep saying that it's really a partnership between the student, the professor, and the advisor, or in your case, human resources, the employee, and the professional. And it isn't always like that, and I suspect many of you will nod your head to that, because sometimes you get requests for accommodation, and you have some doubt about them. And I remember one case in particular being on the phone with a physician who was explaining how he was trying to accommodate this student and help her. Then he turned to the student, didn't realize I could hear. He said, well, what do you want me to put down for your accommodations? Right? So if there is work that needs to be done in that area, it's in trying to ensure that that is a partnership. I'll leave that one with you. Now I have time for one more quick story. Psychologist Oscar Wilde, Irish author, famous for his quips and little expressions. I have nothing to declare, he said at the customs. I have nothing to declare except my genius. He also said, only an enemy stabs you in the back. A friend stabs you in the front. Psychologists, unfortunately, were not like that. We don't have witticisms, but in graduate school, they drummed into us, the best predictor of the future is the past. But I imagine they drummed that into every blessed student everywhere. But anyway. You see, when our son came with the request for the dog, we should have been more ready. Because at 6 years of age, 6, with his older brother 8, he came to us requesting that he play hockey, ice hockey. Well, his parents, who come from another country, were a bit unsure, given that our exposure to hockey was Saturday night, and this was the old days when the Montreal Canadiens played the Quebec Nordique, and the gloves dropped before the puck dropped. Like, it was a lot of fighting. Who wants to subject their sweet, loving, tender little boys to that? Oh, no way. But he knew how to get to us, because he said, Mom and Dad, you grew up in Ireland. Yes. Ireland, no ice? No ice hockey. Yes. It is every Canadian boy's dream to play ice hockey, and if I can't play ice hockey, you are denying me my Canadian heritage. 2 days later, they're both enrolled in hockey. Now, that's me, but I'm happy to answer any questions you wish. I'll also hang around here at the front if you have any questions. I'm not in a particular rush.
Thank you, Mike. There are some mics at the front if anyone wants to come forward with questions for Dr. Condra.
I have shocked them all into complete silence. Is that possible? Yes,
Yes.
there is a question over here. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the end of your question.
Sorry, the question was, what advice do you...
Oh, okay. What advice, so just to repeat it in case anyone didn't hear, what advice would I have for colleagues or others that we might see struggling, we think perhaps a mental health problem in the workplace? Is that fair? Good, okay, thank you. That's a great question. And it often comes up. I think I'm going to start first of all with our own experience about talking. Many of us are afraid to. We don't want to because it's uncomfortable, which it is, it's uncomfortable. So I'll tell you some do's and don'ts. The do is, you need to accomplish 3 things. First, I think you need to take initiative and talk to the person. Secondly, in talking, keep your focus on what you see. And I used to use this little phrase when I was doing mental health education. Well, when I am doing mental health education, say what you see. Say what you see. And I'll tell you why that's important. Say what you see. And the third thing is, ensure that in the approach, you're conveying to the person, I'm concerned, I'm worried, I'm supportive. That's where we want to be. Things to avoid, don't use psychological language. I had somebody say to me many years ago, apropos of the same thing, when should I ask this person about anorexia nervosa? And because the person was very thin and wasn't eating. And I said, why do you think she might not be eating? And then we began to list, it was a barbecue. She didn't like the food. She's vegetarian. She's going to meet her mom and dad, and they're buying her a lovely meal, not this junk that you're getting off the barbecue. The barbecue is dirty. She had a dentist appointment. All of these are much more frequent than anorexia nervosa. So no psychobabble, no words that suggest you have some kind of diagnosis or understanding of what the person is going through. Focus on the behavior. I see you're not eating much. Is everything okay? And that may be as much as you need to say. Or if the person's been kind of irritable in meetings, and maybe you've had 2 or 3 meetings, Jim, I noticed that you're a bit edgy in that meeting. Is everything okay? Or can I help? So phrases like, can I help? Keep your focus on the behavior, only on what you can see. Sometimes people are distressed because they have a mental health problem, and sometimes they're distressed because they're having this is a technical phrase again, sorry to use it, a crappy day, like really bad day. And sometimes they're like that because something is happening at home with their spouse, child, or friend, or dog, or whatever. And so focus on what you can see. Don't make any conclusions about what might be going on. And make sure the person knows you're doing this from a position of caring or support or wanting to help. Does that help? Thank you.
I have a question. So I think everyone in the room has seen the impacts you're describing of that the isolation and stress during COVID has had and is taking a bit of a toll on many people's mental health. Do you think that when things go back to normal, do you think when it's passed, do you think that people will just bounce back quickly, or do you think there'll be like longer lasting effects?
Good point. So will it happen quickly, or will it happen slowly? I'm going to give you the safest possible response. The longer the disruption, the longer the recovery. If COVID had lasted 6 weeks, which we all thought, oh, come on, love, I'm looking forward to Canada Day with all my friends and party of 53 people, and masks will be a thing of the past. It just didn't happen. And part of that is that, part one, we develop habits, we develop ways of doing things. I now put on a mask when I go into lots of different places. Like, that's a habit. 3 years ago, I wasn't doing that. It made no sense. That's part of it. The second is, I talked about this waves and back and forth and long lasting. That makes people a little bit edgy about bouncing back, because there may be a question in the back of their mind that actually we could be changing again. And there may be some people for whom this, for whatever reason, did not cause them the huge disruption that has caused it to many. Those people certainly will bounce back very quickly. But we have to remember that will be quite variable. So, a short answer, yes, but it may take time.
Thanks. Any other questions? So I first met Mike when we spoke together at a conference on coping with mental health crises in the workplace. I think in 2019, pre-COVID, pre all of this. And I found that his expertise as a psychologist was incredibly helpful to helping understand mental health issues in the workplace. And we always, when we are consulting with you guys or when you're consulting us, we talk, we're always running on any kind of health issues, mental or otherwise. We're not a doctor, you're not a doctor. We have to make sure you get that information from someone with professional health training, and so this is I thought a helpful layer to add on so we can hear from someone who really does have that expertise and inform our decisions. I thought the point about not trying to make a diagnosis is really important, because that gets discussed, right? We've all had discussions like, oh, I think this person might be suffering from depression. But you may have an idea in your head, a potential diagnosis for the person, but I guess when you approach them, you don't say, are you depressed? I think, and that's not going to go well, but
Yep.
You could say, I noticed you haven't been talking much lately,
That's right.
or
Yep.
you're not as smiley as you usually are, or whatever it is, like to
Yeah.
focus on the symptoms rather than
Yep.
putting a diagnosis.
Say what you see. Um, I have lots of humorous lines, such as the person who said, Mary, you haven't been to many parties. Do you have social anxiety disorder? You know, of course, we all know Mary says, oh my God, thank you. I was wondering what this was, you know. No, keep your eye on what, you know, or maybe Mary in the back of her head is saying, no, I don't have social anxiety disorder, but meeting idiots like you at parties is one of the reasons I don't go, right? So just keep your focus on the behavior, and truly that is the most likely to help. Even if the person says to you, no, I'm fine, and walks away, that's okay. You haven't damaged anything. People's mental health problems do not worsen because somebody reaches out to them. They really don't. Okay.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Anarita. We have a little gift for you.
Oh, how wonderful is that? Even better. That's right. That's right.
Anarita's doing a little jog. Thanks so much for joining
welcome.
us today. I just wanted to note again for everyone's benefit, because Mike does provide consulting on specific situations or training for your management staff, things like that. If you're interested in that, we've included his material, his information in the material, so you can reach out to him and find more details. And the book that I mentioned that he wrote, which is also referenced in the materials, is really, it's really great. It's a really practical how to do it, and how to, particularly dealing with when you're dealing with, you know, suspected mental health issues and someone who might be in a bit of a health crisis, and you know, it's really difficult to know what to do and you want to help the person but you don't know how to handle it. It's got some really great tips for, like, sort of simple, plain English. These are warning signs, you know, where you should do further inquiries. But, you know, they might not be. It might just be a passing thing. But anyway, a lot of really practical how-to tips. So I definitely encourage you to look at those resources. We're going to talk about this issue, sort of how you deal with some concerns like this afternoon in the final session back in this room at the end. I don't know if you can stick around or not, but you could sit on that panel with us for sure.
Well, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is only for me. Roughly 45 minutes from now, I'm going to be heading down to a little school in the western side of Toronto to pick up our absolutely sweet, adorable, totally charming 5-year-old grandson. And I'm sorry, I really enjoyed this, but I'm not sticking around. I'm not going to miss that.
I thought that was too good to be true.
Yeah.
I was going to say, has he asked for a puppy yet? You should arm him with the arguments.
No. His dad still wants a dog. And his dad is determined. He's so determined. He said, Mom and Dad, you could keep the dog. I said, you're 41. You're still trying the same rubbish on us. His son is a little sweetie, so I'm sorry. This is definitely the highlight of the month for me. We will be playing hockey and soccer. He's a Tottenham Hotspur fan.
Well, it's in his blood, the soccer.
Yeah.
Thanks, Anarita. There you are. Thank you so much.
Very much. Thank you.
It's a pleasure, always.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. A little nervous, but I really enjoyed it.
You were amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.